How's everybody doing today? I am joined with Dr. Matava. Matava, that's how you pronounce your last name, right?
That's right.
Is it okay if I call you RJ?
Yes, that's fine. Of course.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about the De Auxiliis controversy a bit. So I like to harp on you guys a lot and tell you that when you're reading St. Thomas, that you should not only read the Summa, you should read his commentaries on scripture, you should read some of his popular works, you should be reading some of his Opscula. These are very important things to read. But also, there's a lot more to the Thomistic tradition than St. Thomas himself. You have the Baroque Thomists, you have the Leonine Thomists, you have even some of the Vatican II Thomists. So we're going to be taking a very small slice of this history and talk about De Auxiliis. So, RJ, will you first give us a little bit of just the dry history behind it before we get into some of the theological players of De Auxiliis?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me on today, Christian.
No
Pleasure to
problem.
be here. So the De Auxiliis controversy, you can kind of look at it in its narrow context or its broad context. Narrowly, it's a 25-year-long theological quarrel between Thomas and Molinus, who, I mean, in a broad sense, you might call Thomists. They're all commenting on the work of Aquinas. So one of the things about how this controversy fits into the landscape of what you've described of Thomism is that you have people who are really intentionally trying to stick close to Thomas, especially the Dominicans, but also some members of other orders, Mercedarians and Carmelites and so forth. And then you have members of the newly formed Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, who, in a very broad, maybe kind of in some ways eclectic sense, could be considered Thomists. They were engaging the work of Aquinas. And basically, questions that St. Thomas and that the Council of Trent left unanswered about grace and justification became a matter of great controversy following the Protestant Reformation and the aftermath of the Council of Trent. And so the controversy itself spans the quarter century period from 1582 to 1607. It began with a debate at the University of Salamanca between a Jesuit, Prudencio de Montemayor, and Domingo Bañez, who was a Dominican, one of the most famous of the Thomist commentators, and in his own day, as well as still today, he's revered by Thomists as one of the greatest figures in that tradition. They had a debate about the free will of Christ in 1582, and that's widely considered to be the beginning of the Controversie de Auxiliis. There are a lot of stages that happen in between that I'll try to describe, but ultimately the controversy is terminated in 1607 by Pope Paul V, who just imposed silence on the disputants and said, you have to quit accusing each other of heresy, await the final decision of the Holy See, and no publication without the express approval of the Holy See on matters de auxiliis. So not quite the outcome that everyone was aiming for as the controversy unfolded. But I think in some ways that ushered in a new paradigm for dealing with theological controversy that had some wide implications. So that's when it happened. A couple of things to note about the broader context, and then maybe I'll just say a few words about the stages of the controversy itself within that time period that I described. We've got to understand the De Auxiliis controversy as part of the wider wider current of events that was going on in ecclesiastical history, especially surrounding Augustine's teaching on grace and predestination. So St. Augustine works out in his own career. You see a shift in St. Augustine's teaching on grace, and this is a lot of ink has been spilled over this. Did Augustine change his mind from his early career to his later career, etc.? But you see him in some ways pivot from his early anti-Manichaean writings, where he stresses free will strongly because the Manichaeans are determinists, to his later anti-Pelagian writings. And there he's stressing divine sovereignty and the divine initiative much more for obvious reasons. His opponents now are the Pelagians, who have a very sanguine view of even fallen man's abilities to take the initiative in salvation. So some people say he changed his mind. I don't think that's quite what happened. I think you have a difference of emphasis and that his position reaches its mature stage even before the Pelagian controversy. You can see this in his letter to Simplician, who became his successor later as bishop. And there, already, long before the Pelagian controversy, you see him wrestling with this question of free will and predestination. And I think what really triggered that for him was his reading of St. Paul. So it wasn't so much that it was a change of opinion occasioned by controversy, as much as it was he was immersing himself more in the scriptures and began to have a more and more profound and developed insight into predestination. But even so, my feeling in reading through that work is that you just feel Augustine writhing with the difficulty of dealing with human moral responsibility and the divine initiative and grace. And so what this leaves is a legacy of unanswered questions about how exactly to understand the relationship between grace and free will. And I think, to his credit, Augustine had a very profound understanding of creation and divine transcendence. And so he didn't have the worked out technical vocabulary or conceptual structures to bring perfect resolution to how you express that mystery. But he also didn't short circuit the mystery and didn't take any shortcuts or easy ways out. And so you see this tension just in his writings, but where he doesn't deny free choice of the will, he's affirming it along with the divine initiative, and it just kind of sits there as a tension that he's just struggling with greatly. And the legacy of that for centuries was other thinkers that tried to kind of dispel that tension. This went on through the 8th and 9th, 10th centuries. In some ways, you can see it in the high medieval tradition. And then especially it came to a real flashpoint with Luther and Calvin and other reformers with their teachings on justification. So that's kind of the long prehistory of De Auxiliis. An immediate bookend, well, maybe if you think of it as two bookends, are the Bionist controversy on the front end and the Jansenist controversy on the back end. So to really situate De Auxiliis, it's helpful to know a little bit about these post-Reformation debates about grace and free will. And within the Catholic tradition, you had the teachings of Michael Dubai, who was a theologian at Louvain, who in some ways was saying things that sounded a lot like what Luther and Calvin were saying, and in some ways sounded Pelagian. So it's kind of a strange system, if it's even a system. And he was censured by the church. But a lot of the content of the De Auxiliis controversy is already there in the Bionist, in the debate over Michael Dubai's teaching. And then after 1607, after De Auxiliis is terminated by the Pope, you have the rise of Cornelius Jansen's teaching and others that followed that. And that also was multiple times censured by the church. So if you look at it in that context, the question that De Auxiliis was dealing with, and which was never officially resolved by the church in any kind of theoretical or doctrinal way, really had kind of a very long prehistory and even a very long post-history. And it remains a question that to this day doesn't have any universal consensus or official resolution from the church. And another thing that's really fascinating, some of your listeners probably know about this, but a lot of people don't. The debate that was happening within Catholicism between the Thomists and the Molinists, or roughly the Dominicans and Jesuits, though it wasn't precisely, there were people from other orders that were involved, was a debate that was mirrored in other confessions. So the Lutherans had a parallel debate between the Philippists and the Gnesio-Lutherans, and within Calvinism, within the Reformed tradition, you see, again, another very similar debate between the Armenians and Richard Hooker and people like that, and the more traditional kind of Dort Synod Calvinists. And so I think that's fascinating, because here you are at a time in the life of the church where the church is reeling with the division between the Catholics and the Protestants, but here a debate that's really central to what divides Catholics and Protestants is being debated within each of those confessions, and the sides within those debates mirror each other more closely than they do their opponents within the same confession. So all of that, in simple terms, means we've got a big mess on our hands, and we have for many centuries now. And I see this question that De Auxiliis was trying to get at in some ways as kind of the elephant in the room. So that's kind of De Auxiliis in its wide context. Would it be helpful to say maybe a little bit more about the actual historical unfolding of the controversy itself?
That would be great. But before that, I was going to make the same comment about the Protestant tradition because I come from a background very interested in 17th and 18th century Protestant scholastic thought. And what I was first introduced to this controversy through reading those authors. And if you read Bishop John Davenant, he was one of the people at the Synod of Dort, which was the big council over this Arminian issue. And he was actually looking back and reading Banez and Molina and Bellarmine. So it's very interesting that this wasn't accidental. They were consciously looking towards the authors as their as the better theologians to argue these issues based off of. And Francis Turretin in his Institutes of Eclectic Theology, that's where I was first introduced to arguments against middle knowledge. So that was very interesting. But yes, please go into the historical unfolding of these events.
Yeah, no, it's great that you're bringing up those sources. There have been some interesting theses written in the last few years on these sources, and I think this whole period, whether you're in Reformed scholasticism or post-Reformation Catholic scholasticism, this is a greatly understudied area, and so I think it's just great that you're familiar with those sources. And I've seen the same thing. The Protestants were watching what was happening within the Catholic debate and just waiting for their vindication. So there are many were watching this debate and waiting for the condemnation of Molina, which seemed to be so imminent at many points, and they were just ready to see that as a vindication of their own view. I remember coming across a book at St. Andrews by Samuel Rutherford, where it was clear that he was tracking this debate too. He was another one of the figures that was watching this, and whether the Dominicans definitely didn't want to align themselves with the Protestants, but it seems to me, and I haven't done the legwork on this, but I always had the impression the Protestant authors that were watching this were pretty happy with aligning themselves with the Dominican view. They didn't seem to have a lot of difficulties with it. So it wasn't a two-way street in that way. The Dominicans wanted to distance themselves from the Protestants. After all, that's what the Jesuits were accusing them of being too Protestant in their view. But the Protestants seem to be very happy with the Dominican view, from what I could tell.
You'll get the funniest comments coming from some of the Protestants about this. Reading Francis Turretin, he just absolutely despises the Jesuits, and then they look to the Dominicans as like amazing, and then when this controversy doesn't get resolved, you get the comments from I think Francis Turretin is where I read this. He talks about like the absolute impotence of the papacy, like the papacy is horrible. Like, guys, look at this. This just proves that the Pope isn't the head of the church. He can't even kick out the Jesuits. Like how bad the Pope is. You'll get the funniest comments coming from these guys because they are absolutely livid when this doesn't get resolved.
Yeah, and actually it goes both ways too. So some Protestant authors are looking at the Jesuits and they're not admitting that they're reading Jesuits because that's going to get them into trouble. But clearly there's a stream of influence. There is a good article that I remember reading by Nigel Voke about this, where he shows the influence of Jesuits like Molina, I think it was Molina, maybe Suarez or Bellarmine, on Richard Hooker. And so I think that these streams of influence were coming in from both the side of the Dominicans and the Jesuits, and they kind of aligned with the two sides in the Protestant debates. One thing, this is kind of an interesting story. Before this show, we were talking about being able to access these sources and how that's getting easier and easier thanks to the internet. But back when I was doing my dissertation, it was still pretty hard to get some of these sources, and I was doing that over in Europe. But one of the most helpful resources for my project came out of a Protestant seminary in Escondido, California. One of my friends there had microfiches and microfilms of a Dominican commentary on the Summa that I needed, and I couldn't find it easily anywhere else, and it wasn't digitized. So in one case, he digitized these microfilms. In another case, he very generously allowed me to digitize the microfiches myself. So but it was amazing. Of all the places in the world to find these Thomist sources, it was in a small Protestant seminary, I think in the Reformed tradition in Southern California. But it was clear to me just by making that connection and seeing like the theses that were coming out from people associated with that place that it seemed like there was a real resurgence of interest in this topic among Protestants, and a real interest in Thomism, especially because they see their view vindicated there. So as far as the controversy itself, I mentioned it began in 1582. It ended in 1607. If you kind of take it narrowly from the broader unsettled grace controversies that bookended it, and all of its centuries longer antecedents. And you can think of the controversy as unfolding in a series of major events or stages. There's, of course, a lot of detail here that I'm going to leave out just so that we can talk about other things, and I can direct you to some sources. In fact, can I share something fun with you? This is, I brought this in today with me. This was my secret Santa gift from one of my colleagues here. This is actually one of the two monumental histories of the De Auxiliis controversy. This was published in the year 1700 by Jacques Hyacinthe Seri, who wrote under the pseudonym Augustin Leblanc. This is the title page. I'll share it with you. This is a pretty good secret Santa gift to get, if you ask me. So I've got some great colleagues here. But there were two kind of very detailed early histories of the controversy, and they were polemical. They were not kind of detached, isolated, objective histories. These were they related the facts of what happened, but definitely with a perspective toward one side or the other. Seri's history, which I just showed you, was one, and then Livinus de Meyer, who wrote under a pseudonym also, Theodore Eleutherius, wrote the other, and they're both enormous, detailed histories of what took place, especially in the meetings of the papal Congregation De Auxilias. But skipping over all the details that those authors cover in their 700-800 page tomes, he started out with a controversy, or a debate rather, at the University of Salamanca over whether Christ freely died for our sins, whether he freely laid down his life, if the Father had a precept, if the Father willed that he do this. And the Jesuits said that if there was a precept that would have bound his will, determined his will, then he wouldn't have done this freely, and he had to have done it freely. Therefore, there wasn't such a precept. And Banez said to the contrary, this is part of God's plan, and he did decree it, and it was still free, though right away we see that the two sides, both of which want to uphold freedom, are going to conceptualize freedom differently. So this is one of the things that, at least from the Dominicans' point of view, they say distances them from Luther and Calvin and others on the Protestant side, who hold for a bondage of the will. They will affirm free choice of the will, but we've got to be careful when we're reading Dominicans and Jesuits that we don't assume that they have a univocal understanding of that. They understand the freedom of the will differently. So this is the debate that triggers it. Francisco Zumel was the one that organized the debate. He was a major player in the De Auxiliis controversy as well, and so he's a figure that shows up right in the beginning. And the result of this is that Jesuits are turned over to the Inquisition, and their thought is censored, and this kind of triggers this controversy. But another, actually, before the major event, another thing that happens, I mentioned Michael Dubai at the University of Louvain. He was censured by the Pope, but he was very influential, very powerful, and he had a number of followers at Louvain. And so Louvain remained kind of a stronghold of Bionist thought. This is in the Low Countries, so we're not like down in Catholic Spain or Catholic Italy. There's a little bit more going on up that way. And so the University of Louvain becomes a hotbed for debate about predestination and grace. And there were earlier antecedents to all this. But it even got to the point where students were having fistfights in the streets, according to one account that I've read. And that's far removed from our times. But back in the 16th century, students cared enough about these matters to get into bar brawls, evidently. So things were unraveling there. And the point at issue was the teaching of Leonard Lessius, who was a Jesuit, his teachings on predestination, and the followers of Michael Dubai. So Molina hasn't exactly entered the picture yet in a major way, but you can see already there are other Jesuits who are anticipating the view that Molina, Luis de Molina, will give. definitive expression to. So Prudencio de Montemayor in the first incident, now here Leonard Lessius, who was reputed to be a pretty holy guy. I think he was, known as a moral theologian, but he wrote on a number of different issues. And he got into this squabble about many propositions that were being held by the university faculty, faithful to bias. They, in turn, were concerned about a number of propositions Lessius was teaching, which they thought were heterodox, including his view that predestination was post praevisa merita, or after foreseen merits. In other words, Lessius was teaching a view that Molina also held, that predestination was conditioned upon the foreseen merits of the predestined. And Aquinas's view is obviously different from that, as we see. I think maybe you went over that actually in an earlier podcast that I dipped into. You can see in Thomas's teaching on predestination.
Yeah, I think it's Prima Pars, question 23, Article 4, maybe.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's definitely question 23. Article 4 sounds right to me, but I'm not certain of the article. But definitely Prima 23. And so in other words, we had this first incident. Now we have another incident, and actually the way that this all ends anticipates how the controversy winds down. So the Pope intervenes. Things are kind of getting out of control, and he basically imposes silence on the disputants and says, the Holy See will settle this matter, which it never did. But that's how it was dealt with. In other words, the theoretical debate at Louvain was dealt with not by being resolved, but by the imposition of ecclesiastical discipline. And we saw exactly the same thing happen with Paul V ultimately in 1607. So I mention that because I want to circle back to that point later, and we try to think a little bit more about the wider implications of this debate. But I think that's a really significant fact, that the debate is dealt with in this way, just by discipline and the imposition of silence. Another big event happens next, now down in the Iberian Peninsula, so moving from the Low Countries back down into Spain and Portugal. And there we have Luis de Molina, who's one of the most famous protagonists in this whole controversy. Typically, the two biggest names that you hear are Domingo Bañez and Luis de Molina, though there are certainly other protagonists, in some ways maybe even more significant than them. Their names go down as kind of being the poster children for the De Auxiliis controversy because of their seniority and their involvement in early stages of the controversy, where the state of play was really defined. But it was the next generation of followers that really carried their ideas forward and spilled really much more ink than they did on these controversies. So I think especially if people like Francisco Suarez on the Jesuit side, or on the Dominican side, Diego Alvarez and Tomás de Lemos, who were the two representatives of the Dominican order at the actual sessions, the meetings of the papal congregation De Auxiliis. But Molina enters the picture here in a really important way. He publishes a book called the Concordia. This is in 1588. It's a massive tome, something like the size of what I just shared with you. And this was mostly a commentary on just a few articles of the Summa Theologiae, but of course, being that length, it was a very originative commentary. And it was there in the Concordia that Molina set out his theory for how to reconcile, or how to explain the concord of grace and predestination, the divine initiative, and human free will. And immediately that book was reviewed by the Dominicans, by Bañez personally, and found to be wanting. And so this triggered like a massive acceleration of the controversy. And initially, publication of the book was halted because of these concerns about its heterodoxy, and then it was allowed to be published. And once that was out there, that created a lot of stir. And remember, too, the printing press is still relatively new. So this whole possibility of getting ideas out there so rapidly with such wide dissemination, I mean, it's nothing like what we can do today with the internet. But it was a kind of comparable sea change, I think, to the medieval period, where now ideas could be printed and replicated. And so Molina's ideas started to spread, and that was very concerning to many of the Thomists that were out there, like Domingo Bañez. So that marks another big stage. The controversy escalates. We'll skip over many details. It escalates through around 1594, 1595. when finally the Pope intervenes again and says, send all this material to Rome. And accounts that I've read say that there were chests, like massive chests of material. And actually, to that, I'll be the first to say, I've been studying and thinking about this for over 15 years, going on 20 years, and there is far more that I don't know about it than that I do know. There's far more that I have not read than that I have read. There's just a tremendous amount of ink that was spilled on this, and including in the years after the termination of the De Auxiliis controversy, where it kind of continued to simmer within the schools. And so the task was to collect everything that they had and send it to Rome, and the Pope was going to establish a special commission to review all this material and come to a judgment. And that commission was founded in 1597. That was called the Congregatio De Auxilias. So the controversy De Auxiliis, the wider historical event, is the one that I'm describing. But more narrowly, the Congregatio De Auxiliis is this papal commission that met during the final stages of this controversy. But the final stages lasted a decade, from 1597 to 1607, and they met scores of times in different formats. They had representatives of the different orders in a room together debating. Then toward the end, they actually had the Pope himself sat in on the sessions and was going to adjudicate it personally. So that's kind of the final stage of things. Once it was sent to Rome, there was a papal commission that delved into the matter. It's interesting to look at some of the dynamics of that. It seems the Jesuits were almost always the ones on the hot seat. The Dominicans were criticizing the Jesuits. The Jesuits were never condemned, but it looked like they came close many times. There were some accounts that the Holy See deemed to be spurious about imminent condemnation of the Molinists. This came out in a work by Tomás de Lemos, the Panoplia Gratiae, which was published many years after his death, where I remember looking at this book. I don't have a copy of it, but looking at it years ago in the library, there was this woodcut or this etching on one of the pages where you had, I think it was Clement the VIII at the time, sitting there in the papal throne, and on the wall behind him in this picture, there's a satchel with a scroll sticking up in it, hanging on a nail, and it says, it says on there that this is the condemnation of Molina, and it's as if the Pope is just about to reach over behind him and take this condemnation and hand it over and promulgate it, and he died, which actually Francis de Sales and Robert Bellarmine both predicted would happen. He died before promulgating it. And then, interestingly, they had a papal conclave, and the candidates had to take an oath to resolve the De Auxiliis controversy if elected. So this was a high priority item. Can you imagine this being a high priority item in a papal conclave today? Maybe it should be, but at the time, this was the issue. And actually, it repays consideration to think, why would they have felt that way? It seems very foreign to our own times, but they could very clearly see the significance of doctrine for the unity and life of the church. And so the idea was, if you're going to be elected Pope, you've got to get this thing resolved. And so everybody took an oath to do that. Leo the 11th was elected and then was determined to issue a decision on this, but died after, I think, only about 27 days. It was one of the shortest papal reigns in the history of the church. And then you went, I think, from there to Paul V, and the remaining years of the controversy played out under his rule. And he was the Pope that actually was sitting in on the discussions of the Congregatio. So that's kind of the climactic period that everybody thinks of when you think of the De Auxiliis controversy. Usually you're thinking primarily of the meetings of the Congregatio, or in the presence of the Pope, where the Dominicans and Jesuits are hashing it out there in Rome. But those other events are integral part of the controversy. And then the way that it ends is ultimately in 1607. By this time, by the way, both Domingo Banez and Luis de Molina are both dead. So again, think of them as influential kind of figures that instigated this, but they weren't engaged in the high point of the battles. It was their followers in the next generation. So Banez died in 1604. His dates I should have given you were 1528 to 1604. So 3 years before the end of the controversy. And by 1600, he was winding down. in terms of his professional career. And then Molina from 1535 is a little younger, 1535 to 1600. So he died before Banyas, and 7 more years of controversy unfolded. So they never lived to see the end of this controversy. But the Pope ultimately decided to just suspend the matter, suspend the debate. He forbade publication on these matters without the express permission of the Holy See. And what happened was actually the debate continued. I mean, you had Jansenism, like I mentioned. The different sides were allowed to hold and teach their own views within their schools, but many times over the subsequent centuries, popes had to step in and reimpose silence because the debate kept breaking through. So that was reiterated many times. And within the schools, the literature just abounded on this. And what I've been finding recently is that there are not just 2 monolithic positions, or even 3 or 4. Like usually you hear that the Dominican Thomists against the Jesuit Molinists, and then kind of everybody knows there were also variations of the Jesuit view, the Congruists like Bellarmine and Suarez, who really were the dominant ones going forward. Like Molina and Lessius were a little bit more extreme in their views, but the order didn't actually go with their view. Ultimately, the Jesuit order went with the Congruist view, which was closer to Thomism. The Congruists believed that grace was antecedently efficacious and intrinsically efficacious. They believed that predestination was logically prior to foreseen merits. And so all those things make them much closer to the Dominicans' position, but still they were essentially Molinists. They still had the same idea of freedom. They still believed in middle knowledge. They thought that you had to have middle knowledge to secure the divine initiative. And so, most people know about congruism. There's even the Augustinian school that came in the 18th century and tried to have a kind of a middle way. They argued for moral premotion of the will. But what I've been finding is, besides those kind of major positions, within the schools, there were some dissenters on both sides. And I find that really intriguing, because one of the most dominant characteristics of the controversy is that what you see is that parties solidify, into their own schools, and then it's mostly like it's as if they see this as a battle of us against them. And the trouble is that theologically they just don't get traction anymore beyond that point. And the fact that you have undercurrents within both the Jesuit side and the Dominican side suggests that there were people that were able to get beyond that kind of impasse, and they were really trying to figure this thing out. And they had the honesty to try to see through the shortcomings of their own views, even if they didn't quite get it right in the end. They were still not satisfied with the way that things were in the standard position. So there's a lot more work to be done on that. It's been interesting for me to kind of drill down into that a little bit more. Just 2 other comments that occur to me while we're talking about the history. One is that I mentioned earlier the Dominicans were always in the driver's seat, pretty much. And it's worth thinking about that and why. This was handled, I think you could kind of look at the De Auxilias controversy as largely from the Dominican side, a kind of like a legal proceeding almost, where you had the publication of what appeared to be a heterodox book, and that needed to be dealt with. And so that being the case, it was always, the Jesuits were always kind of in the hot seat. They were always on the run. The Dominicans were always kind of the pursuants. That wasn't universally the case. The Jesuits did try to turn the tables on the Dominicans in a variety of ways, and there were points at which the Thomist view was scrutinized, though it was never scrutinized in the same way. And it seems to me that the Jesuits were trying to get at the metaphysics of the issue more, and the Dominicans, of course, were really concerned with the metaphysics of the issue. But as the events took place, it was more kind of a formal proceeding about a heterodox publication, whereas the Jesuits weren't trying to go after any particular publications of the Dominicans so much. It was more trying to figure out their idea of divine causality and what its implications were, and whether that implicated them in Protestantism. So if that makes sense, there's more to say about that. But Understanding the asymmetry of that debate, I think, is important. And then to circle back also to how it all ended. Remember at Louvain, silence was imposed during that early stage of the controversy. And then in 1607, the Pope Paul V ended it that way. And it's important to appreciate how, in some ways, how kind of unusual that is. Think of earlier centuries when there was a theological controversy. Bishops got together, they held a council. In fact, there were some that urged, I think Bellarmine was one of them, they urged that the Pope should call an ecumenical council to deal with this issue and resolve it. That obviously never happened. But in earlier centuries, you saw things like that happening to deal with, for example, the Christological controversy, the Trinitarian controversy. And here, after the Reformation, the Pope is content to just impose silence and say, let's move on. Probably the Pope's mind was divided between the two sides, and he didn't have the advice or recommendations that he felt he could move forward with, right, because they were stuck at this impasse. But I think it's really significant that it ended that way because on the heels of this theological controversy, which was left unresolved, you have, right, the philosophical enlightenment, the scientific revolution, all the events that we now look back and call the advent of modernity. And while I'm speaking in overly simplistic terms, I think I'm still speaking truthfully to say that I think that there is an important relationship between the origins, the philosophical origins of modernity, and the way that the faith or the church at this time was not able to give a fully satisfactory rational accounting of itself. People are very rational. And even though these topics seem extremely arcane and far removed from everyday life, it was a topic that was on many people's minds. And thinkers that are famous to us today for their scientific or mathematical discoveries actually were really engaged with this question. You know, Newton, Pascal, Malebranche, people like this were thinking about grace and predestination as much as any other topic, if not more. And I think here, you know, what happened was you had a problem of the magnitude of the Christological problem or the Trinitarian problem. How is it rationally tenable to maintain that one God is three distinct persons? How is it rationally tenable to maintain that one individual is both at the same time divine and human? Those seem to be, on the surface, illogical claims. And the church in the past, you know, answered up to those challenges, those philosophical challenges to faith with doctrine, and resolved the controversies, even though they were messy, and even though the controversies continued to simmer, like any student of the history of Nicaea or Ephesus or Chalcedon knows. But there was a doctrinal response, and that didn't happen in this case. And while theologians continued to spill tons of effort and spend tons of effort and spill tons of ink over this question, theology itself became more and more isolated from human knowledge, the body of human knowledge as a whole. And it became the kind of ivory tower stereotype that we hear about now. And meanwhile, people, you know, said, well, look, apparently we can't get any consensus on this matter. Maybe it's not possible for reason to arrive at truth in matters of religion. And instead, let's invest our energy in empirical science and its application, right? Its technological fruits are useful for bettering the human condition. And so I know I'm painting in very broad brushstrokes now, but I think it's important to appreciate the way in which this controversy was ended and how that related to the origins of modernity, and how significant of a practical matter for the life of faith it really is that this question went without doctrinal resolution. I think it was a moment in the church's history where the church was called upon to give a rational accounting of its faith, and there were some very honest attempts made. It's a very difficult matter. It's probably the hardest thing to think about that I've ever encountered. But at the end of the day, what you had were the sides solidifying into party positions, and then just trying to get, you know, a wall of brass kind of within their own side and go up against the other, rather than being willing to have the vulnerability to really drill down on the issue and concede weaknesses in their own views. Both sides are very good at caricaturing the other side. They're very good at pointing out the obvious weaknesses in the other side. And in many instances, if not all, they're right. Those criticisms of the other side, I think, are sound. But both sides also show, I think, a lot of weakness in being able to concede at least difficulties with their own view. It's like a show no weakness kind of posture. But that impeded their ability to get real theoretical traction on this matter. And I'm not an expert on what happened within Protestantism, but I think something like that happened in the other confessions as well, with the result that the faith didn't give an ultimately satisfactory rational accounting of itself. And by that I mean not just satisfactory to people within one party or another, but in general across the church as a whole. And the world moved on. Theology became kind of ghettoized, and this is, issues of predestination have been the theological elephant in the room for going on almost half a millennium now. So, and meanwhile, we had modernity that happened, and it's kind of taking leave of Christian faith. So, a lot more to flesh in there, but I wanted to offer that just as a way of seeing this in wider context, and seeing how I know that your listeners probably don't think of this as a marginal debate, but I think the tendency to think of this as a marginal issue is very strong, and but I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, this is really interesting to contrast with the way it went in the Reformed world, because the Arminians, they were condemned at Dort, and you had Hugh Grotius, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Grotius. Grotius had to escape to France in a box because he was an Arminian, and if you were an Arminian, then you had to run away. And it's very interesting that you didn't get this same condemnation happening to the Jesuits, even though you've had, and I wonder about this. You had a lot of these amazing Thomistic popes. You had, for example, back to back Leo the 13th and Pope Saint Pius the 10th, and both of them reigned for a really long time. I think combined it was probably 40 years of just the reign of Saint Thomas in the Vatican. And you didn't get this question really dealt with, but I guess they had other more important problems that might just be the reason why nobody really dealt with in the future, because you're dealing with the Satan that is modernism. And I don't know, maybe you have a comment on that.
That's I think that's a really interesting point. And to my point about how it all ended in 1607, this issue came back to, it didn't come back to haunt the church. It's haunted the church this whole time, right? So the modernist issue, you'd have to do a lot of work to connect all these dots, which in my summary here are very distant one from another. But the matters that the popes at the turn of the 19th, 20th century were preoccupied with were matters that I would speculate are not altogether unrelated to this failure to give a rational accounting of faith. So they may not have been centrally interested in predestination, but they were, I think, in some ways dealing with the fallout of the church's inability to maintain doctrinal cohesion and clarity and rational articulation centuries earlier. And it's interesting too that in a way within the schools, the De Auxilias controversy was still happening up through their own day and into the mid 20th century. It was really up through the 1960s that I see literature on this. And for the most part, while there were kind of dissenting undercurrents within each of the schools, or some attempts at innovation, a couple maybe we can circle back to later, are particularly noteworthy. In general, the same lines are being debated through the early 20th century and through the lifetimes of these popes. And another point of connection to pick up on something you said, consider how the modernist controversy ended, if it ever did. Right? How did that end? You read Pascendi, which has this brilliant synthesis of kind of what modernism is. It seems to be a pretty insightful attempt to try to make a coherent account of something that isn't in itself very systematic or coherent, and to help make sense of and identify it. And then you're kind of waiting for, you see what it is, you see the critique of it, and then you're waiting for and so what now? Like, what do you do about it? And you get councils of vigilance. And so there again, you've got a theoretical problem that isn't being answered theoretically. In many ways, Pascendi is theoretically brilliant, but at the end of the day, it puts the lid on modernism with the enforcement of discipline. And this is what we saw happening in 1607. It's what we saw happening at Louvain. So again, I'm being uncautious in the breadth of the brushstrokes here, but I think there is something here. After the Reformation, you don't get the kind of definitive doctrinal resolutions that you had in centuries before. Even consider ecumenical councils. I mean, you had Trent, many centuries, Vatican I, another century, Vatican II. The historical periods between the councils were really protracted compared to earlier centuries. They become much more infrequent. And so there's almost like a new paradigm for dealing with theological disagreement, and that is just kind of ignore it. Just prevent it from destroying the church, prevent people from fighting, slap the dressing on the wound and hold it there really tight, which is good to do at first, right, to prevent a patient from bleeding out. But at some point, you've got to go in and actually fix the problem. And so you mentioned modernism. We'll look at how that ended up, and not only look at how it ended up in Pascendi, look at how it ended up over the century following. Look at where that we are today as a church. And you've got to get to the bottom. You've got to hear out these concerns and objections and actually deal with them in an intellectual way. And that didn't happen with modernism, and it didn't happen with predestination. And meanwhile, you can see what's happened in terms of the relationship between faith and life in the Christian world, or what some people now call the post-Christian world, over the last several centuries.
So in the last 15 minutes we have left, there was something very insightful that I read in some of the material that you had sent me to prepare. You had, I think it was something that you had come up with. I'm not sure whether you were taking this from somebody else. But you had those 3 points on which the Molinists and then the Banyesians disagreed. And then you gave a little bit of your input and thoughts about some other theories that were put forward. So getting into a bit of the theoretical framework, could you go over that just a bit for us, and then some of your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So let me try to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of the two major views: the Thomists, the Dominican Thomists, and the Jesuit Molinists. And then I'll try to sort of tell you what the current state of the question is today, after the last century, from the period of the popes you were talking about onward, and then kind of where I land on all this. So the Jesuits, we'll start with them because they were kind of the focus of controversy for the reasons that I described. So there's three kind of central principles that their view stands on, and the most fundamental of those is their view of free choice, human free will. And Molina's famous description is that human freedom is the ability to do one thing or its contrary, to act or to not act, positis omnibus requisitis ad agendum, which is like on the supposition of all prerequisites for acting. In other words, with all the antecedents to choice supplied, free will is the capacity to do one thing or another, to act or not act. So none of the antecedents to choice are predeterminative of choice. That's the most fundamental principle, I think, of the Molinist view. And so I think you can describe their view as anthropocentric, that if that's a helpful term of art, right? That they're starting with man and with our situation, our experience of moral responsibility, our experience of decision-making. And they're writing in reaction to Luther's bondage of the will and other sources like that. So they're going to be staunch champions of what today we might call libertarian freedom. So to account for that, while still within a kind of a orthodox commitment to divine providence and the divine initiative, how do they bring those things together with two other elements? These are the other two of the three important principles of Molinism. The second is divine concurrence, and the third is middle knowledge. So you have human free will, and yet they know that God causes free choices. The Molinists don't simply say that God is not causally involved in the choices we make. They say that God causes our choices by this indeterminate concurrence of his will, this influx of efficient causality, which we determine through our capacity for free choice. So concurrence that is indifferent divine concurrence that is indifferent and that's determined by the human recipient is key. And that is affirmed both on the natural and the supernatural level. So grace is made efficacious by the human response to it, at least for Molina. Some other congruists would give you a slightly different spin on that, but grace is made efficacious by the human recipient, by his acceptance of that grace. And even on the natural plane, when you're just talking about God's aid, that's not grace, not supernatural. Still, it's determined by the human free will. So there's that. God is involved, but in a way that doesn't take away that freedom described in Principle 1. And then the question is, well, how does God maintain sovereignty, right? Providential sovereignty, if man is free in this way, and if his concurrence is merely indifferent? And the answer is through his middle knowledge. And this was really the most unique contribution that Molina made. Many people today that hear of Molinism just think of Molinism as the doctrine of middle knowledge. And so it's important to see that middle knowledge is just one piece of the puzzle. And actually, in some ways, his view of causality is more fundamental, and especially fundamental is his view of freedom. But middle knowledge is this idea that God knows what free creatures that he could create would do in any variety of circumstances within which he could place them. So he calls this middle knowledge because it's somewhere between God's knowledge of possibles, right? So God knows his own nature, knows his own essence, and he knows everything that's creatable in light of his knowledge of his own essence. And then on the other hand, God knows by his knowledge of vision, both of which distinctions you can find in Aquinas. Question 14 of the Prima Pars. He knows by his knowledge of vision what actually is, what he's actually created. And everybody admits those two classifications of divine knowledge. But what Molina introduced was another form of divine knowledge in between those two. And it was his knowledge of what was kind of possible for God, not absolutely possible, but possible on the condition of human free determinations being what they are. And so that's what middle knowledge is really about. It's God's conditioned foreknowledge, not just of any possible future, but of futures that are possible to realize given that person P in some given set of circumstances either is going to do one thing or he's going to do another. And which of those two things is not determined by God. So while it's possible for person P to do one thing or another in this set of circumstances, and God knows those two possibilities in his simple knowledge, given that the person is not determined by God, for God to maintain providential control over what actually happens in the real world, he has to foresee, by his middle knowledge, says Molina, which of those two possibilities the person would follow were he to be created in those circumstances. So you have the domain of the possible, and then you have a more circumscribed domain of what Thomas Flint calls it the feasible, right? Worlds that God could realize. And then you have his knowledge of the actual world. So by creating, in light of his knowledge of the future, hypothetical future contingencies, creating in light of his middle knowledge, God maintains control over what actually happens, but not by determining the will in any way. So that's the three principles of Molina's view, and the most novel is the third. If we had more time, we could kind of go into more of the objections about that, but that's the view. The Dominican view, if you say that the Jesuit view is anthropocentric, starting with their commitment to human libertarian freedom, it's probably fair to say that the Dominican view is theocentric. And so they begin with God's universal causality. And they say, look, there are certain fundamental principles that you just cannot compromise on. And one of those is that God is the sovereign creator of everything that is. He's the cause of the esse, the existence of things. His causality extends to all that is. And so whatever is the case with human beings or with salvation, right, that you can't hedge on that basic principle about God's universal causality. So starting from that commitment, they proceed to give an account of God's sovereignty, his initiative in matters of grace and salvation, and then they give an account of human freedom. They don't deny human free choice of the will, but they say it's not the ability to do anything, one thing or the other, in the presence of all antecedents for acting, because there is a divine predetermination of the will, pre-motion of the will. And on the condition that God pre-moves the will, that there is this pre-motion, this influx of divine causality, the will can't do otherwise. So the Dominican view is a kind of determinism, but use that word very carefully. It's not determinism in the ordinary sense. There's at least no normal created cause that determines the human will antecedently. Rather, God is predetermining the will. And so you say, well, what's the problem? And what the Jesuits pushed back on and said was that this pre-motion, what is it exactly? Right. So this is an illustration of my point earlier that the Jesuits, the Dominicans went after the Jesuits for publication. The Jesuits were trying to go after the Dominicans on the metaphysics of causality. Right. So they're pressing them for clarity. And what I think happens over the course of the debate is something that is kind of a marginal concession for the Dominicans becomes centralized, right, through the pressure of controversy. So really what the Dominicans and the Thomists always wanted to just say was, God is the primary cause. He's the universal cause. You can't say that the determination of the human will falls outside the scope of his causality. That's what they're really committed to. That's what they really want to say, and they do say. But when pressed for clarity on how all this works, they say, well, he pre-moves the will. What does that mean? Well, he predetermines the will. And well, what is that predetermination? And then you start getting this more and more elaborate account of the metaphysics of God's causality, according to which this pre-motion is not a created substance, but it's a created motion. It's not God, but it's not the human action. And it is antecedent to the human action, and it does determine the human action as a kind of sufficient reason for it. And that's where the opponents say, hold on, that sounds like compatibilism or determinism. Okay, so I won't hash out all the details of the debate, but that's in a sense where the Dominicans are coming from. They start with their commitment to those principles of divine universal causality, and then they're kind of in a way backed into a corner about the metaphysics of pre-motion. And instead of kind of clarifying that concept, they double down on it. And the pre-motion, which maybe in some ways the language of influx was supposed to be metaphorical at first, that becomes reified to where now we're talking about a literal influx of some creaturely reality that antecedes your free choice and is determinative of it. A lot more to be said about there on how the notions of causality are developing from Aquinas' day. I think it'd be a fascinating study to look at early modern views of causation and how that notion evolved. But for Aquinas, it seems to me, if you read like his teaching on the divine will, question 19, article 8 of the Prima Pars, or his teaching on providence in question 22, article 4 of the Prima Pars, or his teaching on creation in 45.3, if you kind of put those texts together, for him, God is the universal cause of all being, both necessary and contingent. And what it is for him to cause being, what it is for him to create, is to bring about the existence of things, and his action is understood either as the divine essence or as a relation in what is created, right? Relating it back to God. So you don't have this kind of antecedent, predeterminative created reality. You just have the relation of what God brings about to him. And so there's a subtle shift, which I think is very easy to make and very intuitive, between that view that you find in Aquinas and the view that you're starting to see crystallize at the late stage of the Controversy De Auxilias, which is carried forward through the 17th and the 18th centuries. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the two views, kind of the anthropocentric commitment to human libertarian freedom and the more theocentric commitment to divine universal causality. Both sides want to do justice to both of those things, but like all these kind of Augustinian debates, one side is always privileging one or the other, emphasizing one or the other more. When it comes to the current state of the question, it seems to me that if you're not satisfied with one of those two classical positions, or even one of the three classical positions, you can throw the Augustinians in there. And I'm lumping together the Congregatio and the Molinists, but if you take basically the Jesuit view inspired by Molina, the Dominican Thomist view that is inspired by Banez and finds full form in Lemos and Alvarez, and then the 18th century Augustinians, if you're not satisfied with those kind of historical views, moving into the 20th century, I think you have kind of three places you can go. The first in historical order, and the closest to those positions that I just outlined, within Thomism at least, is Francisco Marin Sola's view, He's a Dominican Thomist. He gets into a famous quarrel with Reginald Gregory-Lagrange, who is sort of the modern heir of Banez and Alvarez. And he defends, that is, Maransola defends a view of impetible premotion. So he's still attached to the idea of physical premotion. He's very intentionally trying to stay within his camp, within his school. But especially post-Jansenism, he's recognizing weaknesses, and he just can't swallow everything about the traditional view being carried forward by Gregory-Lagrange. And he's also extremely knowledgeable of the Thomist tradition. He has a work called Concordia Thomista. I believe that's the title. There's no modern English edited form. Michael Torre has done a lot of brilliant work on this. And there's a Spanish version of this, I think, underway. A friend of mine in Spain is working on. So it'll be amazing contribution to see that come out. But Maransola has an encyclopedic knowledge of all these Thomist authors that we're talking about, and many others that we've probably never heard of. And he puts together, right, in the form of notes, this very extended synthesis of their views, and finds some support, a good bit of support for his view that God's premotion is impetible. That is to say, the creature, there is a premotion. God does predetermine the will, but there is some capacity of the creature to resist that motion. And so this is supposed to avoid the weaknesses that the Jesuits are most worried about in the Dominican Thomist view. So there's Maransola. I've written a piece on this. I'm not persuaded by his view, though it was carried forward by many other people in the last century, the most famous of whom was maybe Jacques Maritain. I think Cardinal Journet also held a view like this, inspired by Maransola and others. A second view that has been very influential in the last century is Bernard Lonergan. So in 1940, he completed his dissertation on operative grace in Aquinas. Now, Lonergan was a Jesuit. He was schooled in the Suarezian Congerism that was carried forward within his order. Not persuaded by it. He's a critic of Molinism and of Banesian Thomism. And he puts forward what in some ways is a very originative proposal, whereby God pre-moves the will through his arrangement of antecedent conditions to choice. So this is not the idea that there is a physical premotion, some kind of influx of created causality that determines the will. Rather, the will makes its determination within a context. And God so arranges that context such that the will does just what it does. We don't have time here to go into the details of his account. I think that it's well understood by some of his advocates, in general not well understood at all, including by critics, and most people have either ignored Lonergan or uncritically accepted him. That's my sense of kind of the state of the question. It took me a long time to kind of really figure out his position. I had to read and reread and reread Lonergan. And then I'm confident I finally see what his view is. And it's a brilliant proposal, but I don't think it works. I think it's flawed. I don't think he's able to defend free choice of the will at the end of the day on the view that he holds. I go into this a little bit in my book, but Lonergan is another major player, and people today tend to either just assume he resolved this question, mainly theologians, I think, are of that persuasion, or you're a philosopher and you don't read theologians and you haven't read Lonergan or heard of Lonergan, and so you've just kind of ignored him. And so Lonergan doesn't figure into most of the kind of analytic philosophical literature that's come out in the last 20 years on this, as far as what I've seen. Michael Stebbins did some brilliant work on Lonergan's view, and people like him understand it well, but they believe that it's correct, whereas I think that it's incorrect. So that's the second of three views. A third way you can go, I think, is the view that I hold on to, that I find advanced by several different authors. I'll call on Matthews Grant because I think he's done the most helpful work of anybody on this recently, and that is a view that I call total personal creation. That's my own nomenclature, but call it what you will. And I don't want to speak for other authors that I'm calling on here, but I think I see several people articulating basically the same view independently, in some cases independently from each other. And this is not exactly Lonergan's view or Maransola's view, although some of these authors I'm not even sure are that aware of how different their view is from them. But this is the idea that God makes to be your act of free choosing just as such, and that there isn't a pre-motion of the will. There's no created entity that determines your free choice, nor is it the case that and it's not that it's impedible or unimpedible. There's no physical pre-motion. Nor is it the view of Lonergan that God arranges the antecedent conditions to choosing such that you choose just this way and not any other way. Nor is it Molina's view that somehow the determination of your will eludes, at the end, final analysis, at the end of the day, eludes God's causal purview. And as much as they don't want to say that, I mean, the Jesuits don't really want to say that any more than the Dominicans don't really want to say physical premotion is a created entity that determines the will. They kind of, but they're backed into that position because they've got middle knowledge. The fact that they have to lean on middle knowledge reveals that at the core of free choice, there's something that eludes the causal scope of God. And so I think that's a problem. So that's not the way to go either. So this view, unlike that, affirms that God causes free choices, and he causes their total reality insofar as they're good. I mean, it doesn't cause the privation, but insofar as there's anything positive in an act of free choice, that is caused by God. I think that's a very Thomistic view. I think that's Aquinas's view. But it doesn't invoke any form of premotion or Lonergan's Aristotelian premotion. And so I think it avoids some of the shortcomings of these other views. For example, it avoids the shortcomings in the Dominican view that the Jesuits were criticizing. It avoids the kind of causal autonomy that the Jesuits advocated, that the Dominicans criticized, and it gets around some of the shortcomings of the proposals of Lonergan and Maransola, as much as those are instructive contributions in their own right. So that's kind of where I see the state of the question today. You know, it's a controversy that has exercised many minds, and of course, anything that you say is going to invite a response from people who disagree. That's the nature of the controversy. But it seems to me, as a Catholic thinker today, unless you're going to go with one of the traditional views, which I think were soundly mutually criticized, you've got Maransola, Lonergan, or the view that I defend. And I in other works have shown why I think those other two views, Maransola and Lonergan, are not ultimately satisfactory.
And what is your take on this? Since I'm assuming you're not just coming at this as a disattached sort of historian, that you actually care about these issues. So what is your take on your final analysis?
Yeah, I think that the idea that God creates acts of free choices is the way to go, and that has to be rightly understood. I mean, God is the creator. I'm not a creator. But it's not that God makes my choices for me. It's that God gives being to my act of free choosing in its totality, insofar as it exists and insofar as it is good. So my self-determination is dependent upon God all the way down, insofar as it is good and it exists. And so it's related to him. There is a tertium quid, right? Everybody's account has some kind of tertium quid. I don't think it's the tertium quid that's a problem. The problem is that when you've got a tertium quid that is a created antecedent to choice that determines choice, that lands you in the space of compatibilism or determinism. Some people are satisfied with that. I'm not. I am not okay with compatibilism or determinism. And at the same time, unlike most libertarians, I'm also not okay with saying that human self-determinations are causally autonomous and are not dependent upon God. I think you've got to say that is dependent upon God. And I think that's the tradition. I think that's philosophically sound, but I think also for biblical reasons and in terms of the doctrinal tradition, you've got to say that. So the view that I would defend isn't either of the two classical positions, and it's not either of the two predominant new proposals of the 20th century either. But it's a view that I'd like to think really is a recovery of Aquinas's view. Aquinas didn't ask the same questions that we ask post-Luther, post-Trent, post-bondage of the will. And so it's a little bit anachronistic to expect to get crystal clarity in his writings on this question as it was framed in the Reformation, post-Reformation period. But I do think he has the resources for getting at this. And so the view that I've tried to sketch for you really, really briefly there calls upon Aquinas, and I think really tries to bring forward with post-Reformation clarity the principles that he gave us writing in the time that he did.
Yeah, so it's sort of a paleotomism, so to speak. I definitely like to talk to you about that a little bit more some other time. We're going on an hour and 10 minutes, so thank you for coming on. Is there anything you'd like to plug? I don't know how much writing you do. Maybe you have a book.
Yeah, so I've written on this. What I'll do is maybe mention some resources that I've written that listeners might find helpful. There's a great deal of literature on this. Some of the best work has not been done by me. I mentioned the work of Michael Torrey on Maransola, Lonergan, and Stebbins' work on Lonergan. Garrigou is clear just as he is. So I've written a book, Divine Causality and Human Free Choice. In fact, I'll show you a copy of it. Try to get it at your library. It's unfortunately prohibitively expensive.
Is
But
it a
I go
Brill
into
book?
it's a Brill book. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, it is. But here's a plug. If you are affiliated with a university that gets Brill books, you can get a Brill My Book copy of it for $25. So that's great, right? The Brill list price is very high, but if you're attached to an institution that gets the Brill titles through your library account, you can get a hard copy, a paperback hard copy for, I think it's like $25. So some listeners might find that helpful. And there, some of the things that I think are especially helpful toward the end, I elaborate the proposal that I just sketched here that I think is the right way forward. I also give you the critique of Lonergan, and there's a section in there that engages with Suarez on divine causality, which was very helpful for me as I worked through those texts. Again, one of the things you find is that the sides caricature each other, but when you really drill down, they're both way more plausible. I realize I'm disagreeing with both sides, but that's the fruit of spending years really trying to honestly climb inside of those two positions as much as I could and try to understand them from the inside. And when you try to understand them from the inside, they're both very plausible in their own way. But part of that plausibility is the plausibility of the criticism of the other side too. So the treatment of Suarez in the book, I think, is helpful. More recently, I wrote a historical sketch of this whole controversy that came out in the Journal of Jesuit Studies. That's an abridged version of a longer paper that I'm happy to send people that want to read it. But that kind of gives you an introduction, a relatively short introduction to this whole controversy. And then in the most recent edition of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars Quarterly, I have a piece on Maransola, some of the things we were talking about in the very end here. So those things are out. They might be helpful or of interest to readers. I have an essay that'll be coming out soon in the T&T Clark Companion to Election on the undercurrents within Thomism. We talked a little bit about how the sides in this controversy aren't totally monolithic, so I'm trying to investigate a little bit more of the lesser well-known views among Thomists after the Controversia De Auxilias. I have a piece on that coming out soon. And but really have a look at everything that's out there. There's a lot to read. Matthews Grant has done probably some of the best work on this topic, not historical but analytical, that I've seen. So I really recommend his work. And if I can make any plug, I'm the dean of the graduate school at Christendom College. So we have a theology graduate program. And if any of your listeners are interested in Aquinas, he's really at the center of our program. That's one of the things that distinguishes us here, is that our curriculum has a heavy emphasis on primary sources, especially St. Thomas. So if you're interested in studying theology at a more advanced level, even if you just take a course casually, or whether you're interested in a master's degree, do consider Christendom. We have a great program here.
Yeah, as an additional commendation for Christendom, I've seen some libcaths get very mad at Christendom. So that it must be good if you're getting the libcaths mad at you.
Yeah, I think we have a great program, and we have some great students here. So we're always looking to add to that number.
Okay, thank you for coming on, and for everybody listening. Actually, we're not live right now, so this will be going on tomorrow. So I'm not sure what I have going on later, but I guess yesterday we had our Q&A, and I'll be Yeah, I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing. This is weird. I'm usually I usually know exactly when this is going to be going on, but I'm sure I'm having something later. So check it out, and thank you for everybody watching, and thank you, RJ. I definitely look forward to continuing to talk to you about this issue, and I'd love to see if there's anything else that I could bring you on about. Definitely thinking about more of the dogmatic question rather than necessarily the historical theological question. So if you'd be interested in that, I definitely like to set up a second interview on that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on today, and thanks to all of our listeners.
Yep. And I will talk to everybody later.